Okay, everybody, welcome to our Trophy Hunter segment. We have a special guest today. This is a noted big bass expert who has expanded to other species, but I've known him for a long, long time, and every time I have a conversation with this guy, I feel like I learned so much. He's Mark Rogers. He is the I almost said you're the president, but I know you're not the president. He's the sales manager for Akoma Fishing USA. And Mark, welcome to our podcast.
I appreciate it, Keith. It's nice to be back. I think we did our first one of these about 18 years ago. Wasn't so technologically advanced as today's Zoom meeting, but it's good to be back with you.
Yeah, I know. I used to be able to hide behind the microphone and radio, but now I'm in front of a camera, and it's well, it just takes a little getting used to. But, let's talk a little bit about back then. Back then, there was very little internet access. I don't think there was a YouTube back then. People wanting to catch big bass, they had to do it the old-fashioned way, right?
Just get out and do it. I started throwing a Swimbait in 1994. I had some experience experimenting with other lures like surface iron that guys use for yellowtail. I was catching largemouth and striped bass on those pre-Swimbait, introduction. But yeah, I taught myself from the ground up, which I'm pretty proud of, to be honest with you. The kids and adults today, they have the benefit of learning from the internet. They can learn a lot just by doing research. And I utilize research today in all of my fishing activities. I was researching last night up until about 1 o'clock for tomorrow night. But back then it was all trial and error. And the successes that I had back then kind of gave me a warm and fuzzy. It made me feel good that I accomplished something on my own without the help of somebody else. Of course, our inner circle that we had, shared knowledge, but it wasn't at your fingertips like it is today.
Right. I mean, anybody who's willing to hike down that canyon wall at Silverwood in the middle of the night, you share a bond with those guys, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've done that many a times for sure. I put your kid on some bites there at that same exact lake, taking those trails on down. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yes, you did. You did put my son on some bites at that place, and there were many a time as a father of a 18, 19-year-old that I sat there waiting for him to get home because he was there at middle of the night. I know what he was doing. He was hiking down that cliff to get there. But anyways, he always made it back, and he did catch those fish. Speaking of which, he's had me on swim baits for about the last 2 years. I've done almost very little conventional fishing since then. I feel like I've learned about that much about swim baits, which is still a lot more than I used to know. I think one of the things I'm really starting to understand is that your typical 3 and 4 pound bass is very different than a trophy sized bass. Before we answer that question, why don't you define what a trophy is for me? Because I, in my mind, know what a trophy is. In my mind, but in your mind, what do you think a trophy bass is?
It varies by person to person. For me, a bass really didn't matter unless it was a double-digit fish, a 10-pound fish. But for the guy that's just getting into it, that trophy might be a 4-pounder,
right?
And that 4-pounder is an accomplishment for him, and that's not taking anything away from him or saying that I'm better than him because I call pounder a trophy and he doesn't. It's tough. The swim bait game today, it was easy back then. It really was. In the early 90s, all the way through the 90s, there was very little participation doing it. The guys that were doing it were so hyper focused on it that they really didn't talk a whole lot. And here comes the internet, and boom, the knowledge is thrown out there. But for me, it was always a 10-pound fish, and fortunately, I've been pretty successful in my bass fishing career to catch a lot of those. But it came with a lot of hard work, and it came with a lot of days of not catching them. I went a stretch where I fished 18 days at Lake Casitas and I didn't catch a fish. Um, that's a long time to go and not have your spirit broken.
Yeah.
That 19th trip, I think I had a 14 pounder, a 13 pounder,
Oh my God.
a couple 11 pounders. So, the hard work pays off if you just stick with it.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. You gotta stick with it. So now I wanted to ask you the question I was going to ask you. So these typical 3 and 4 pound bass that we might find, out there, conventional fishing. What's the difference between a fish like that and a trophy size, a double-digit size fish? Besides the obvious weight, my contention is that they're different animals. What do you say to that?
Yeah, 100%. Just like you and I, we've grown up in our age and we've expanded our knowledge just in everything in life. The same goes with bass. Our lakes are so small and they're so pressured that for a fish to get to be 10, 12, 15 pounds, it gained knowledge throughout the course of its life. And what I've seen in just about everything that I'm doing is pounders, they're not in the same zone or have the same mindset that the big fish do. The majority of people throwing swim baits to even today are very shoreline oriented. My experience coming from the saltwater background of working and running boats is I learned how to set up on structure. Making that critical cast in the right position and angle and everything about it to try to trick that fish, because most big fish that I've caught, the vast majority of them have been set up on some sort of offshore structure. Because I caught a lot of my fish out of a boat, when I started doing this, I was all shore pounding. I did nothing but fish from shore, but I was taking that same, research and that same attitude. I wasn't only going down the bank casting. I was a sandbar or I was finding a ledge and positioning myself to make the right cast to, get to that big fish that was probably sitting there because he felt safer. That 3 and 4 pounder, he's swimming around happily doing whatever he wants, but that big fish, he's leery. He's smart.
Yeah. Now, so the other day I was at Paris throwing a wake bait early in the morning, and I had a pretty good day. I had 3 fish on it. Couple of them, one was about 2.5, one was about 3, and one was 7. And I thought, that 7 pounder, that's not really a trophy size fish because it was doing the same thing that those other fish were doing. It was bizarre that a fish like that would all of a sudden pop up.
It's seasonal. You're going to see a lot more commingling of fish in the summertime than you will in the spring, summer, and fall. Maybe the spring there'll be some commingling, but in the winter and the fall, which is when I had my most success targeting big fish, it was a completely different zone. I'd go out there and I would catch, nothing but 8 to 12 pound fish offshore. I wasn't getting those 3 and 4 pounders when I was doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So now you just touched on something I want to talk about because to me this is a never ending. There's a couple things, but particularly weather and barometric pressure. I know you like the worst, the nastiest stuff because I can remember back in the day we had a couple of interviews lined up and you had to postpone because the barometer was dropping. So tell us about that.
Yeah, the lateral line in all of these fish that we target, whether it's bass or striper or even trout for that matter. I'm learning a lot about trout right now, and I'm focusing on trophy trout, and they react differently to barometer than bass do. But in the case of bass, they are hypersensitive to barometer change. It's a trigger for them to start feeding because there's adverse weather coming. And anytime you have a dropping barometer, you have an opportunity to catch a big fish, regardless of what season it is. Typically in the summertime, the barometer stays more consistent. Even in the afternoon thunderstorms that we're experiencing right now, there's not a whole lot of barometer drop. get that massive cold front that comes in, from Alaska, that barometer drops, from 31 to 29.4. Man, you better be on the water, because that's your opportunity. These big smart fish slipping. That's ultimately what it is. They start feeding heavily. They let their guard down more. That's a good way to put it for barometer fishing. If it's low like that in the mid 29s, that fish, he's going to be focused on eating, and he's going to be slipping.
Now that is excellent information. Now, anybody that is listening to this, you might want to pause, and you might want to go back and play this thing again, because what he just said is absolute gold. This is the reason why people like Mark intentionally go out in the bad weather. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I'd take days off work if I knew a massive cold front coming in. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, another thing I wanted to ask that's somewhat related, and again, it's been a confusing thing for me, is moon phase. Now, it may just be me, but I don't remember the last time I was able to catch a fish on the day after a full moon during the day. Maybe a bedfish, but just for me, I don't get the bites on a full moon during the day. What is your experience with moon phase?
Yeah, we could probably spend 4 hours talking about moon phase right now. I'm the character that believes that moon phase is important in some regard, but there's different elements within that moon phase that give you key feeding windows. I noticed this primarily when I was focusing on muskie fishing back in the Midwest. I spent 4 or 5 years chasing those things, and regardless of what the moon phase actually was, waning, waxing, full, dark, you name it, when that moon crested the horizon, there is a gravitational pull that those fish feel. And regardless if you're fishing a full moon or a dark moon or whatever, if you can focus your efforts within that 45-minute window when that moon is either rising or setting, that's going to be your key spot to kind of focus your efforts on your high producing areas. I started, after I realized how important that was with muskie fishing, I adapted that to my bass fishing, and I started paying more attention to moon rise and moon set more than the actual phase itself. And I used to keep very, very detailed logs, and moon phase and moon rise, moon set was part of that. And I could start seeing a pattern where I would get bigger bites, either around moon rise or moon set, regardless of what the moon phase actually was. So if you just talk about, a full moon as a whole versus a new moon, there's a ton of variables in there that you could probably drive yourself crazy trying to figure out. But rather than doing that, I focused my efforts on just being on my key spots where maybe I located fish earlier in the day and I couldn't get them to bite. I'd make sure I was on those spots that had the bigger fish that I wasn't able to catch earlier when that moon either rose or set, and it was successful for me.
Do you think there's something, because now in my experience, when the sun is low and coming up in the morning, there's oftentimes a good bite, and also in the evening when the sun is going down. Are we talking about something similar there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Wholeheartedly. Yeah. There's different gravitational pulls based on the sun and the moon, and it's just a key time frame, that you want to be in the right zone.
That's fascinating. That's just so many different things coming in. I mean, we could, like you said, you could probably talk for a whole lot of time on this. How about kind of shifting gears right now to line size? How wary of line are big fish? And that gets to the situation where if you're going to catch a big fish, you got to have the right tackle, which means you got to fish big line. But how sensitive are they to that, and how much does line keep a big fish from striking, for example, in your opinion?
So I think in recent years, I think bass have, once again, it goes back to that smart, mentality that they have. When I was doing it, there might only be 3 or 4 guys, early on in my swim baiting career, there might have only been 3 or 4 guys that were out there doing that. Today, any float tube, rental boat, $80,000 bass boat, or kid from shore is throwing a swim bait. So these fish are getting accustomed to seeing them. So, you probably do need to, think about your line size or go to fluorocarbon. I've been under the mentality of, big line because I'm targeting big fish. And a lot of times I'm fishing around some pretty nasty structure. I was always a proponent based on the size of lure I'm throwing. And most of the time it was 8 inches plus,
Yeah.
I would say my average swim bait that I would throw would be 10 inches long, upwards of 16 inches long. I would always throw big line, 25 or 30 pound test. And I wouldn't take water clarity or lack of cloud cover into consideration. I would stick with that because I knew that if I hooked the right fish, I could get him out of whatever he was living in or hiding in at that present moment. However, today it's changed basically because, everybody's doing it. So these fish are getting more leery. That's why you see a lot more guys fishing at night in the lakes that you're allowed to fish at night because, the darkness, it covers a lot of the visibility factor on online as well as, getting a great look at the lure that they're throwing.
Yeah, I guess so. Now, if you were gonna rig up to go big bass fishing tonight, first of all, you might not even go tonight because tonight might not be a good night. But if you were gonna go and you were gonna fish, give us the detail. What line would you spool on?
I would start with 25 pound as my main go-to if I'm throwing a big lure, and that's irregardless of if it's a wake bait or if it's a sinking bait. I've been using over the last 8 months a new fluorocarbon that we actually brought out called Soft Steel. It's stretch fluoro. It gives a little bit of elasticity when you do hook that fish. For when if he head shakes, it's got a little bit of give to it, so it's not ripping the hooks out of its mouth. So I'd start with 25 pound as my go-to. If I was throwing smaller bottom bouncing, like the old LA slider, or something in the 6 to 8 inch range that I'm bouncing off the bottom, I'd probably just go with 20 pound just for the fall factor, make it fall a little bit better on the sink. But yeah, 20 or 25 pound test. There's no reason to go any lighter at night if you're throwing a big bait. I know guys that have been really successful fishing 30 and 40 pound at night. It's a little overkill, but you're going to rip that fish out of whatever they're in at that moment.
And again, are you're a mono or a fluorocarbon guy?
I'm a mono guy for the most part. I've been using more fluorocarbon over the last 5 years than I ever have. I'm not real big on the invisibility factor for bass. If the fish that I'm targeting, it's an opportunity bite, and I think the presentation trumps the visibility factor for catching big fish.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know. How about gear ratio on your reels? I know that's an important thing. High speed, low speed. What do you like?
I personally like 5-to-1 gear ratio reels. The reels produced today, including us at Okuma, most of our reels are 6.3-to-1 or 7-to-1, 7.3-to-1. I prefer a slower gear ratio, just simply because if I need to speed up, I can, but it's tougher for me to slow down on the use of the handle. I feel like I have to focus more on the retrieve, which takes my focus away from the bait and what it's doing. So I'm old school. I'm an old guy. I prefer 5-to-1 gear ratios.
Well, it's just like the crankbait reels that we fish. You know, same thing. You know, you can't over crank a 5 to 2 geared ratio reel. You can really over crank a 7 or a faster one. You can make that. Yeah, you can make that bait look pretty unnatural. That's good stuff. Um, all right, now how about this Rogers Chase rig? I was digging through some old stuff today, and I came across this thing called a Rogers Chase rig, and I know that's associated with you. Tell me a little bit about that.
It's just something that I did. You know, I think I started using that probably mid '90s. And the reason why I started doing that was number one was I witnessed at one of the Clearwater lakes that I used to fish, I witnessed a threadfin shad swimming along and a trout chasing it. And as it passed a weed bed, which happened to be just 5 or 8 feet from me, a bass darted out and grabbed the trout. And, you know, it's like the old cartoon, you know, the small fish is eaten by the bigger fish, it's eaten by
Yeah.
the bigger fish and bigger fish. And I thought, well, you know, maybe, you know, I'm onto something by doing that. And I just wanted to create an atmosphere with the lure that might show that bass that bigger prey that it's targeting slipping, you know,
Yeah.
it's not paying attention. So that's an easy target for it. And I did a number of tests with it with my dad, who used to fish with me, throwing swim baits, where he would throw the chaser rig, which basically consisted of your main line, and then I would put a Bass Tricks minnow. And unfortunately, Bruce Porter is no longer making Bass Tricks anymore. They were great lures. A hollow tube bait, if you will, that was shaped like a fish. I would run that up the main line. I would have ball bearing swivel on it to give it a bumper when I pulled the Bass Tricks minnow back down. I would use a stretch of either fluorocarbon or monofilament that would be, you know, 12 to 18 inches behind it and tie my swim bait on. So it gave the illusion that this trout was trying to get a shad, and maybe that trout was not paying attention to what was going on. And we did a bunch of tests over a wide swath of time. And some days my dad would be using it and he would get more bites than I would, and vice versa. I would be using it and he wouldn't. And we did somewhat of a scientific study on it. And more often than not, the person throwing the chaser rig was getting more bites. So, is it a mainstream thing? No, there are still guys that use it today. You know, there was an article written on it, and I used to talk about, you know, with some of my inner circle, and then I shared it with some people outside the circle. You know, it worked. It just, and once again, today, if someone were to use that, it would differentiate them from everybody else. You know, it throws one more aspect into the equation that maybe the fish hasn't seen, and might get that extra bite that, you know, he's not able to get, you know, using, you know, just the bait alone.
What I've always loved so much about the whole swim bait thing is the innovation and how we keep going. So I mean, that's a great example of some innovation that might lead to something, and what the next great bait would be. You throw many glide baits? Are you much into the glides or the wakes or the dead sticks, or what how do you see that working?
Yeah, I got on the glide bait kick long before it hit the U.S. market. Um, we were buying lures from Japan and Italy, actually, about 4 to 5 years before it basically hit the market, when Butch Brown kind of blew up the scene with it. And it was amazing. You know, we talk about Silverwood Lake. My partner, Mike Bennett, and we would roll down there and we'd fish at night. And then it's, you know, basically at gray light, we would roll over to the biggest community hole that's on the lake. And typically there would be 3 or 4 guys, you know, standing on this spot, but there was enough room for us to kind of wiggle our way in. And on more than one occasion, we pulled up and they hadn't caught anything. We would literally make one cast each. We would stick a fish, we'd drag it on the bank, hide the lure, and run away. Literally, with the striper. And they'd be like, what just happened? Well, that was the power of the glide bait when it first came out. Now, once again, going back to the whole smartness of a fish today, they're less effective than what they were back then, but they're still an awesome tool for the swim bait fishermen. There's so many good baits on the market today. But if you're so hyper focused on one particular style of bait, you're missing out. You have to adjust with the conditions and how the fish are positioned. It's a good bait though.
Okay. Very good. Very good. That's so much information to sit back and try to digest all that stuff. That's really good. Just another question or two at the most. Where do you see the future of swim baits or big or trophy bass fishing? Do you see innovations coming along, or are there directions that you think that the industry could go?
Yeah, absolutely. The industry is kind of funny in the swim bait world. That market is expanding not only nationally but globally. Big bait is big fish, and those that want to target the big fish, more often than not, they need to be using a swim bait. I've been pretty fortunate with my job to travel all over the country and world, for that matter, and fish different destinations. And I've got 10-pound bass out of Texas on swim baits. East Coast, I've caught some big fish on swim baits. And it's not just something that's dedicated to the California market like it used to be. As far as innovation goes, absolutely, yeah, there's more innovation coming. I have actually got a concept that I think would be pretty influential in the swim bait world. We're just trying to figure out, we being Fish Lab, which is we're just trying to put it to fruition. And it's something that's completely unique. It's a spin-off of another lure, but completely different action. And to answer your question, yes, there's more innovation that's out there that hasn't hit that mark yet.
Okay, well, Mark, I really appreciate you coming on and doing this podcast with us today. It was a lot of fun to catch up with you. I look forward to talking to you in the future. It's been good. And as always, what a wealth of information. I'm going to have to watch this over and over and over again to try to pick up little bits as we go. Thanks for coming on today.
Keith, it was great seeing you, and thanks for having me.